I don't know where to put this movie. On the one hand, it was considered a financial failure, netting only around $15 million worldwide. That might seem like a lot in 1986 money, but remember, it was directed by John Landis, the 80s comedy demigod who, every time he bothered exposing cellulose to light, knocked it out of the park. Maybe you heard of some of his movies. Into the Night? Yeah, I'd never heard of it either. So you can see why a measly $15 million profit might seem like a disappointment.
What is she talking about?
Especially considering it featured two of the biggest names in comedy for the time. Yet, on the other hand, Three Amigos managed to transcend theatrical obscurity and emerge from the 80s metamorphosed into an enduring comedy staple.
Yes, we are.
Who hasn't heard of the Three Amigos?
We have heard of you.
But aside from all its comedic artistry and craftiness,
We're not Mexicans. We're from out of town.
and also one of the most fabulous villains to ever don a black hat,
Would you say I have a plethora of piñatas?
you'll notice this movie takes a peculiar turn about halfway through.
Forget it. My guess is this is a singing bush.
Let's go summon the invisible swords.
It slides abruptly from grounded Stooges-esque hijinks to farcical absurdity with dancing turtles, singing bushes, and invisible swordsmen. And it's not as though this is just a natural follow-through of the goofiness front-loaded into the movie. It's a hard left turn into the preposterous.
Let me talk to him. Excuse us. Are you the singing bush?
Right up until this catchy number, there was not a single scenario with supernatural or heroic characteristics like what happens after the number. Just hapless nincompoops fumbling their way into unfamiliar circumstances. So, in the course of writing this movie, why would Steve Martin, Lorne Michaels, and Randy Newman decide that, starting here, the Amigos should begin encountering fairy tale grade shenanigans?
Great job catching the food, Ned.
There must have been a moment in the story that prescribed such a drastic pivot. That moment was here. Every event which occurs after this point in the movie is a hallucination. The backup singer animals, the aloof shrubbery,
Excuse us.
the see-through Don Quixote, even the successful rescue of Carmen and the eventual defeat of El Guapo was all just an invention of the Amigos' fevered, unconscious brains withering towards certain death. Why were they hallucinating? Well, for some reason, out of the myriad of desert animals they're literally surrounded by, the Amigos chose the one most challenging to catch and least substantial to eat: bats. It begs the question of how Ned was able to catch a bat in the absence of a net or any sort of practical light. But the problem with bats, aside from being almost impossible to catch, is they're the most pervasive carriers of human pathogens on the planet. One of those pathogens being rabies, and according to the CDC, symptoms include delirium, abnormal behavior, and hallucinations. So, what the Amigos didn't know was with each crunch into grisly, medium-rare bat carcass, they were further infecting themselves with a debilitating virus hundreds of miles away from medical treatment. Treatment which likely would have sucked anyway. Already dehydrated and exhausted from riding horses all day, it wouldn't have been long before the virus overwhelmed their immune systems, causing stratospheric fever shortly after they fell asleep. This is where the hallucinations start, and only intensify once the virus makes its way into the brain. We should take a moment here and acknowledge the unpleasant reality the Amigos weren't sent to rescue Carmen from the clutches of El Guapo and to restore honor to the good people of Santo Poco. The Santapocans, knowing full well the Amigos lacked the gumption and wherewithal required to execute a successful rescue,
You think they can protect us from El Guapo?
And I have your watch when you are dead?
purged themselves of the circus clowns responsible for the demise of their village. The Amigos were sent into the desert armed with ridiculously bogus directions,
How far do you think we rode before we had to go back and get directions?
which they foolhardily believed, to die excruciating deaths. That idyllic campsite was probably the Amigos' final resting place. If they did ever wake up, they were likely so delirious their awareness never parted from their fever-induced dream state.
Good night, Ned.
Good night, Ned.
Yes, good night indeed. So, the hallucination kicks off fairly predictably. When dreaming, it's typical for the brain to invent scenarios influenced by a physical sensation. Like when you're asleep and you have to piss badly. Your dreams become inundated with toilets or waterfalls. This physical transference explains this scene, where the Amigos are experiencing thirst horrors. In reality, the Amigos are still asleep, burning with high fevers. At this point, their bodies desiccating from extreme dehydration. So a scenario centered around desperate thirst explains all this canteen business. It's unclear whose hallucination we're made privy to. Superficially, it might seem as though we're experiencing Dusty's hallucination, since he's clearly favored in this scenario. But that's not really how brains work, is it? Brains are fond of presenting examples of relief, not actually providing relief. Like Ned here, who has the worst of the lot with a mouthful of grit and having to watch Dusty gulp down a bunch of water. My money's on this being Ned's fever dream. Here's where the infection begins to deepen, and it becomes more obvious we're now witnessing someone's fantasy. If there had been a single indication of mythological or otherworldly influence before encountering the singing flora and fauna, my whole premise would be bunk. Some throwaway peripheral mention early on by the Santapokans of the desert being bewitched or cursed or something like that would have been enough. For example, the monks, who once resided in El Guapo's monastery, were slain in a manner so brutally heinous they were consequently burdened to an afterlife of haunting those who trespassed the surrounding wilderness, inhabiting different creatures as mediums to manipulate the mortal world. Give us something. But we didn't get something. Instead, we got nothing. Evidence of an altered state isn't solely present in the obvious anthropomorphisms and brushes with magical beings.
Correct! You killed the invisible swordsman!
There are more subtle instances of fantasy and self-aggrandizement peppered throughout the latter half of the movie, pointing to a reality generated by an amigo ego. Like this load of crap.
Tree. No, try and hit that cat. No, in the dry riverbed. They're sneaking.
Getting back to Ned,
What was that?
it's notable there are several occasions which all shed equally favorable light on the three men,
Or I'll fill you so full of lead you'll be using your dick for a pencil!
implying either some kind of shared hallucination or one of the men subconsciously advocating for his friends. Assuming the latter, it seems most likely the driving force is Ned. He's shown to have naive, altruistic values
I'm going to start a foundation to help homeless children.
and sometimes boyishly immature tendencies.
Didn't you notice its little balls?
We learn he was a child movie star before becoming an amigo.
I flew one and little Nettie goes to war. Little Nettie, grab your gun. Including when you were known as Little Nettie Knickers.
Which explains his skewed outlook on life and relationships typical of those afflicted with childhood acting careers.
We're not gonna get paid, that's for sure!
His interplay within the group is suggestive of a little brother dynamic,
Look at the little fella. He's tuckered out already.
and it's conceivable he'd idealize his older friends, therefore concocting favorable scenarios for them to play out.
Mount up!
And since Ned's experience of his friends has been predominantly through the lens of the movies they've made together, the scenarios he might invent would be through that same lens. This explains why their adventure starts to mimic the movie where we're first introduced to the Three Amigos. Like Dusty, showing amazing proficiency with a knife as his character does in the Amigos movies. And like Lucky, taking the role of the unofficial leader of the Amigos.
This way, boys!
Lucky also manages himself out of an overly complicated torture chamber, which is a bit of an odd room to find in an old monastery. Was this installed after El Guapo occupied the monastery? Or were Catholic monks torturing people in the middle of the Mexican desert? I guess either scenario seems plausible.
Ow.
Ned even reimagines the personalities of the villains to be more in line with a sheltered celebrity's notion of infamy. El Guapo goes from being a violent sociopath in reality
Find these three gringos, open their stomachs, grab their intestines, and squeeze the shit out of them. Just kill one of them.
to a passive-aggressive pomposity
Jefe, what is a plethora?
who enjoys receiving sweaters as gifts,
It's a sweater!
loves to dance, and is concerned about his age being made public.
He is 33 years old!
One moment, please.
This next sequence of events highlights the theory it's Ned who's running the show. The murderous German aviator/arms dealer takes the time to adorn and heap praise upon Ned in authentic fanboy fashion.
You are My favorite star of the silver screen.
Then comes the accusation of trick photography.
Trick photography.
I'd be willing to bet at some point during Ned's career, a scandal erupted about whether Ned's true abilities with a pistol were as impressive as portrayed on screen. And this exchange is motivated by that insecurity percolating out from his subconscious.
Does anybody have a watch? Preferably one with a second hand.
The German then challenges Ned to a duel
As you Americans say, we will play for keeps.
to establish his gunslinger superiority, which he, of course, loses. Even though we have no idea if Ned is as skilled a marksman as his brain thinks he is. After vanquishing the German, Ned then saves the day by flying Carmen and the Amigos to safety in the Tuppen 601, which isn't the name of a real airplane, by the way. Despite what Ned's brain might think, watching a stuntman fly an airplane imparts precisely 0 piloting skills. Flying an airplane is a skill achieved by rote, and there is no muddling through navigating the mechanics of flight. There's knowing how to fly, the alternative being fiery death. Ned miraculously lands, leading us to the final confrontation. The implausible manner by which the Amigos and Santapocans defeat El Guapo is compelling enough evidence of a hallucination.
We can sew.
But it's more the details of the plan rather than the defeat itself. Why do they need to dress up like Amigos for this plan to work?
So like the wind!
The Santapocans outnumber the El Guapans whether they're dressed like idiots or not. Maybe if they had significantly fewer guns than people, the element of confusion would bear an advantage, but every single village person has a gun, including Abuelita. If they'd all just started shooting at the El Guapans from all directions the second they rode into town, the result would have been the same. Finally, El Guapo is dispensed with, bringing Ned's reverie to a happy closure. But not without punctuating the whole ordeal with the single most persuasive bit of evidence proving this entire epic fantasy is the product of Ned's brain. Ned making out with a village girl who looks like a Playboy centerfold model. If the unconscious brain of a man with the puerile mind of a teenager is going to concoct a sexual figure to engage with, she would be about as accurate as it gets. Incidentally, Rebecca Ferrati, the woman cast for this role, was the Playboy centerfold model in June of 1986. So I ask you, what's more plausible? That there's a secret, metaphysical realm in the Mexican desert where plants and animals can sing, fencemen in predator camo are summonable with nonsensical chants, and 3 functional idiots are able to infiltrate and escape the stronghold of hardened Mexican bandidos, or that 3 functional idiots ate something they shouldn't have. It's comforting to think that after saving the village of Santapoco, the 3 amigos embarked on several more adventures, battling the oppressive evils who threaten the meek and virtuous, before finally succumbing to the rabies virus ravishing their bodies. Time bears no agency in the domain of the unconscious mind. The amigos might have wandered the desert for thousands of years before ultimately slipping into oblivion, paving the way for a virtually endless run of sequels on Netflix. Don't pretend you don't want that.
Let's ride!